A few months ago, I set out on a journey to create a kitbash or conversion from every warlord bolt action sprue. The first part in this video series was a huge success, and now the time has finally come for the second batch of conversions to be documented. Welcome to Kitbash Every Sprue. Part 2. If you have seen my previous Kitbash Every Sprue video, you'll note that I set a couple ground rules for this series. As a quick recap, they are as follows. 1. I'm only doing the latest version of each sprue, and I'm only doing one conversion per body sculpt. Some sprues share the exact same bodies, so I'll only do one from these groups. 2. I will need to use the body from the sprue as the basis for each conversion. 3. At least one part must come from another sprue. 4. Outside of green stuff, plasticard, and other scratch building materials, all parts will come from Warlord games. 5. I will do my best to create new ideas or rarely seen conversions. And 6. I'll keep it all historical, so no weird war or what ifs. The goal is to show how much flexibility Warlord's plastics can offer you, especially if you have a good collection of different frames. One of these conversions will be a preview of my next army project, so stay tuned to figure out which one that will be. This batch of conversions really stretched me to think outside the box and try out new techniques to get some unique models built. In the first video, we took on the German Grenadiers, Japanese Infantry, US Marines, British 8th Army, Italian Infantry, Waffen SS, British Infantry, and US Army sprues. What will we be working on today? How about we get down to it and find out.
Grabbing an Africa Corps body, I did what any sane person would do. I cut it in half. Now you might find this a bit drastic, but let me give you some context. The Africa Corps primarily fought in the deserts of North Africa, and one fun fact about deserts is that they can be extremely hot in the daytime. So one can imagine that some soldiers took the opportunity to rid themselves of their uniforms and bask in the sunshine. I have created quite a few shirtless miniatures for my US Army project, but I've never gone into too much detail about it, so here we go. After removing most of the torso, I used my knife and a file to sand the waist nice and flat to receive a new upper body. I then removed the lower section of the uniform by carefully cutting away, trimming, and scraping smooth with my hobby knife. To soften this area and clean up some of the stray plastic, I applied a small amount of plastic cement everywhere I had removed details. Now that the lower body was ready, I grabbed a Warlord plastic Zulu and did the reverse, clipping away the legs and waist before trimming it and sanding the bottom smooth. After some dry fitting, I used sprue glue to connect the two halves of the body together. The Zulu torso has upper arms molded onto the shoulders, and these were removed so I could attach new arms. But where can we find sleeveless arms? Only in one place, the US Marine sprue. This set, holding a Springfield rifle, is analogous to another set of arms from the German Grenadier sprue, so I decided to swap the weapons out. I removed the Kar 98 from the German arms and whittled away where the US right arm would meet the German right hand. Before swapping the weapons, I carved away the tattered sleeve remnants found on the shoulders of the Marine arms, before clipping away the Springfield rifle and the hands holding it. I also carved a small channel in the US right arm around the wrist to fit over the rifle stock. With all the pieces ready, it was time to reattach it all. I applied sprue glue everywhere that needed connecting before racing against time to get it all attached. The glue does give you plenty of time to position, adjust, and reposition the pieces to your liking. Next, I needed to attach a head. The Zulu neck isn't a ball joint, so I had to cut a channel in the back of the Africa Corps head I had chosen before gluing it onto the neck. The final step was to use green stuff to fill in the holes around the neck, bulk out the shoulders, and make a natural progression from arm to body, and bridge the gaps between the hands and the wrists. After which, this soldier was released for his tanning session. The US Airborne plastic kit is one of the most common boxes that is picked up by players who are new to bolt action. Not only because the V2 starter box included them, but nearly everyone has at least some knowledge of the American paratroopers through the Band of Brothers miniseries. While the kit is great for most players, both new and old alike, I have two issues with it. First, it is seemingly aimed at a more generic later war design, and doesn't fit the D-Day look that I really prefer. I like my pairs to be loaded with combat gear as if they had just dropped into Normandy. Secondly, I'm not a fan of how stiff and wonky some of the arms and legs are posed. It just looks a bit too unnatural to me. So, let's fix both these problems. The first issue I wanted to tackle was the arms. I grabbed this Garand firing set from the US Army sprue, as the pose is really natural and implies a nice bit of weight to the weapon. To simulate the just dropped look, I wanted to load the miniature up with gear. The very nice Warlord metal range has these entrenching tools, and the US Marine sprue has one attached to a backpack. I removed the handle from the tool, and then very carefully removed the backpack from the underside of the tool with a combination of my clippers and hobby knife. To get it to sit naturally on the paratrooper's hip, I carved out a little space with my knife. Then it was glued in place and the handle reattached with sprue goo. From here, I glued on the backpack and a rifle bandolier from the Airborne kit, followed by a knife, canteen, and holster from the US Army sprue. Another way to make it look like the miniature just jumped out of an airplane is to have his helmet chin straps still attached. None of the plastic US Airborne heads have this feature, but the British Airborne helmeted heads certainly do. I chose one that didn't have a mustache, and in a technique that featured heavily in my previous video, I began clipping away the helmet. Once I got close to the face, I switched to my hobby knife so I didn't mess up any facial detail. I then grabbed this American helmet with some netting from the US Army sprue, and I did the reverse. First removing the head, then hollowing out the helmet by alternating between my pin vise and a knife. After plenty of dry fitting, I then attached the helmet to the British head, and then the head to the body, before finally adding this medical pack to the front of the helmet. All that remained to do was to add a little bit of sculpting to the mix. M42 paratrooper uniforms had thick patches sewed onto the elbow and the knees, and to prepare for some green stuff, I used my knife to score the model where these patches would go. I did this to help give the green stuff some texture to latch onto. After mixing up some green stuff and flattening it out into very thin strips, I cut a roughly rectangular shape and applied it to the knee, using my sculpting tool to integrate it into the folds already found on the model. This was then repeated for the other knee and both elbows. The final result may be a bit oversized, but it will make for a great detail in the painting stage. Finally, no good D-Day paratrooper would be complete without some fabric on his helmet, so I rolled out tiny sausages of green stuff, cut them to length, and applied them to the helmet netting in random shapes. After flattening the green stuff a bit, I used my sculpting tool to create a crease in the center of each fabric strip. I filled up most of the space on the netting with this technique, and finally, the paratrooper was ready to drop into Normandy. The Italian Fulgore Division is a legendary paratrooper outfit, which makes it difficult to understand how there are virtually no producers of models for them made specifically for North Africa. which is arguably their most famous engagement. I found this painting representing Fulgore paratroopers in the desert, and wouldn't you know it, the Fallschirmjäger has a body that almost perfectly matches the Italian in the foreground. This paratrooper is wearing shorts, so my plan was to use the fold at the hem of the jacket as the shorts, which meant I had to remove all the fabric creases in the pants to recreate bare legs. I carefully shaved away each fold, trying my best to retain the round shape of the legs. Once this was complete, I needed to remove the large pockets below the waist of the jacket, as these are much bigger than the ones on the Italian uniforms. The pockets were removed, and the remaining plastic was scraped smooth with my hobby knife. The iconic piece of kit the Fulgore used is the so-called samurai vest, with magazine pouches on the chest and the back. To prepare for this, I removed most of the detail on the model's chest, below the jacket collar. Then, I stole 2 sets of Thompson magazine pouches from the US Infantry kit and filed them down to reduce the curved shape. I removed 1 magazine slot from both pouches before gluing them to the chest and the back. While those set, I added some rifle clip pouches that came from the Fallschirmjäger sprue beneath the samurai vest. The next step was to turn the very obvious German jump smock into an Italian Fulgore jacket. I added a small blob of green stuff in the upper thigh and started shaping it to resemble one side of the lower jacket. I kept adding more and more putty and worked it to fill in the cavity of the jump smock and shape the jacket. I let this cure overnight and then started on the samurai vest. Again, using small blobs of green stuff, I began to fill in the vest, using the magazine pouches as a guide. Working in small chunks allowed me to shape the vest a little at a time, adding in more putty wherever I needed. I wasn't too concerned with sculpting folds, as the vest would have been a little more stiff than a uniform. Next up was the grenade throwing arms. The rolled up sleeve arms from the 8th Army scale well with the Fallschirmjäger bodies, so I grabbed one holding a light mortar round. I cut away the hand, and then removed the lower arm from the upper so I could reposition it into a throwing pose. The sleeve from a different 8th Army appendage was glued onto the body, followed by the lower arm we removed earlier. Finally, a grenade-carrying hand was liberated from an Italian arm and glued into place. A second Italian piece that was liberated was a canteen from an Italian body. This was cleaned up and then glued onto the waist, and any gaps were filled with green stuff. I then spent a fair amount of time sculpting some more appropriately sized pockets on the jacket. For a weapon, I snagged this SMG from the Italian Alpini sprue and removed the strap so I could position it wherever I pleased, before attaching the SMG to the paratrooper. Switching gears, I decided to focus on the head. Many Italian paras wore a fabric covering over their helmet, and while the Fallschirmjäger did this also, the coverings were slightly different. Starting with this German paratrooper head, I removed the detail on the top of the helmet and blended the top fold into a roughly round shape. Next, I rolled up a tiny sliver of green stuff and wrapped it around the helmet where the plastic was just blended. I added another tiny sausage of putty and shaped it to represent this rubber block on the front of the helmet. Once the green stuff cured, I popped it onto the model. Next up, I added a strap to the gun from cured green stuff. This was my first attempt at this, and the strap ended up a bit too wide, but I have adjusted in my later models, as you'll see in a bit. All that remained was adding a left arm, and just like the right arm, I spliced together 2 British 8th Army arms before throwing this Fulgore against a numerically superior British Commonwealth attack. The German winter overcoat can be super duper generalized to fit just about any nation, and for our purposes in this video, we are going to turn it Romanian. The last campaign book introduced for Bold Action version 2 was Case Blue, and inside we got access to Romanian tank hunters. To represent one of these tank hunters in plastic, I started by building a Winter German as normal, holding an anti-tank mine and wearing a field cap. Transforming him into a Romanian, however, would require 2 other steps. The first was to give him a Romanian-made Orita M1941 submachine gun. To create one, I would merge a Soviet PPSH and German MP40. I removed the lower receiver and stock from the MP40, then did the opposite on the Soviet gun. Lots of careful trimming was required to get the upper receiver to sit at a realistic height on the lower piece. This was one of my messier jobs, but you'll see in a bit that it won't really matter in the final product. For the arm holding this weapon, I took this one from the German Winter Sprue and removed the rifle and strap. Then I carved out the inside of the arm to make room for the submachine gun. I also removed the hand and replaced it with an open one. Before the glue had time to cure, I glued the SMG to the arm and repositioned the hand so it was holding the receiver. There is a gap in the wrist, but we can solve that later. Because of the positioning of the arm, I was not super worried about sculpting any fine detail into the gap between the upper and lower receivers, so I filled it in with sprue glue and smoothed it out with plastic cement. Once this was dry, I could attach the arm to the body and fill in any gaps with green stuff. The final step would be working on the head. Since he is no longer German, I removed the German insignia from the front of the field cap with my knife, before adding some scoring to the top of the cap where the next round of green stuff would go. Romanian field caps have this interesting dual pointed shape, so I rolled tiny balls of green stuff up and placed one on the front, shaping it into a peak, before repeating this process on the back. I made sure to do my best to blend the 2 patches of green stuff together, as well as create a smooth transition between the plastic and putty. Once this was complete, I used my sculpting tool to add a fold in the center of the cap. To add just a little bit more detail, I cut out a very thin strip of green stuff that had already cured and attached it to the SMG to create a carrying strap. Once the strap was superglued in place, I could send him off after some Soviet tanks. The British Airborne set is brilliant, and the Airborne uniform is very uniquely, well, airborne. So rather than try and repurpose it, I instead glued on a British Infantry arm throwing a grenade on one side, and an Afrika Korps MP40 arm on the other as a captured weapon, before finally adding an airborne head with a beret. Now I know what you're thinking. Wow, brilliant Kitbash, so brave, so much creativity. Despite all the accolades you are no doubt throwing my way from behind your computer or phone screen, I will take this even further. Gammon bombs, which were cloth pouches that were filled with variable amounts of explosives, were developed for use specifically by the SAS and Airborne. To create one, I trimmed the cap away from the grenade before using my knife and pin vise to drill a hole in the bottom of the hand. Into this hole I glued a length of wire, which was then cut even smaller. I used my knife and some diluted sprue glue to fill in the pineapple shape detail of the grenade. Once this was all dry, I used the wire as the anchor to attach a small ball of green stuff, which I then did my best to shape into the gammon bomb pouch, using the edge of my tool to score some folds into the fabric. And just like that, one improvised explosive ready for the table. The Blitzkrieg German plastic kit is one of the oldest in the current lineup, and while the models are pretty good, their age means that they are quite a bit smaller than most of their newer counterparts. This can limit their options for kit bashing, and it took me a good amount of thinking to figure out what to do with this frame. However, with the release of Bolt Action version 3 on the horizon, and the need to model more officers in our forces, one heroic commander came to mind: Captain Kenzendorf from Jojo Rabbit. There was a Wargames Illustrated model produced for this colorful character, but it was a very limited run. So, why not just build him? Captain K begins with this kneeling pose. His iconic pose has him perched on some tactical rubble, so the bent knee here will be perfect. Instead of using the right leg intended for this body, I instead chose to remove a leg from a standing body from the frame. This one seemed to have the pose just right. Because I wanted to retain as much of the upper leg as possible, I cut way around it and into the torso, so the piece I was left with would be much easier to trim to my liking. Once the detached leg was cleaned up, I reattached it to the kneeling body, giving me the heroic pose I was trying to match. The model still needed his tactical rubble, so I dug out this plastic I-beam from my bits box. Then I cut it to fit the base before gluing it to the perched foot, and finally, down to the base. While that's solidified, I decided to tackle the MP-28 submachine gun that is being wielded. Like I said before, most of the other bolt-action sprues don't scale very well with the Blitz German kit, but one is pretty close, that being the Japanese sprue. The Japanese sprue also has one of these submachine gun arms, which is a perfectly suitable surrogate for an MP-28. Of course, it does have that nasty bayonet molded on, so this was removed with my hobby knife. In its place, I glued a small length of paper clip, which was just about the perfect diameter. I then glued the arm to the body, but annoyingly, the matching left arm was nowhere to be found on the Japanese sprue, so I had to cut up a blitzkrieg arm and hand to get it to work. To get the magazine that the left hand is holding onto, I clipped one from a British Sten gun, trimmed it at an angle, and glued it to the hand. The next step was to use green stuff to fill in the gaps around the hand and the arms. But this is just the beginning of our green stuff work. Captain K has these fancy shoulder decorations, I guess? To quickly recreate them, I cut a thin strip of green stuff and wrapped it around the shoulder, followed by scoring the putty with my sculpting tool. After doing the other side in the same manner, I decided to glue on this German head with a strap wrapped around the helmet, followed by adding this magazine pouch to the right hip. I am a sucker for straps on guns, so once again, I cut a very thin strip of green stuff that I'd already cured, and glued it to two ends of the guns with super glue. There are several iconic outfit choices made by Captain K, one of those being the feathers on his helmet. Luckily, the Alpini sprue comes with plenty of tiny plastic feathers. The first was bent slightly with my fingers and glued to the front of the helmet, while the other was heavily trimmed and glued into the gap between the helmet and the first feather. At this point, I could finish up the shoulders. I added a small ball of green stuff above the shoulders and flattened it out to the desired shape with my sculpting tool. This leaves us with one more big feature to tackle, Kenzendorf's brilliant cape. I had never sculpted a cape before, so you are watching live my first attempt, so don't judge the results too harshly. I began by rolling out a decent amount of green stuff until I had a pretty even thickness. Setting Captain K next to the putty to gauge the size, I used my sculpting tool to cut out the rough trapezoidal shape of the cape. Letting the putty cure for about 30 minutes, I removed it from the plastic bag backing and stuck it onto the model. Using my fingers and a toothpick, I gave the cape a bit of flow so as to convey some motion on the model, like the wind was blowing it back or something. After which I trimmed the top to give it a better shape. This was left to cure overnight so I could do some more intensive work over the top of this base. To remove the fingerprints I created fiddling with the putty, I took a fine grit sandpaper strip and sanded the cape smooth as much as possible. To add the finishing touches, I mixed up a new batch of green stuff using a little more yellow putty than blue. This would be used to create the final details, like connecting the cape to the shoulders and then tackling the folds in the fabric of the cape. These were all done by rolling out a length of sausage-shaped putty, pressing them into the cape, and shaping both sides of the new green stuff into the existing cape. I worked from the center outwards, which gave me the shapes I wanted, while also allowing me to blend the new and old putties together as seamlessly as possible. Towards the top of the cape, I added a few more folds, again trying my hardest to blend it all together. And then I connected the vertical folds with the horizontal. And suddenly, Captain K was complete. Whew boy, gonna need a fresh hobby blade for this one. The French Infantry sprue is very new and it's super gorgeous. But it's also very, very French. The long coat is very identifiable and not really compatible for other nations' units. So to use these bodies as something other than French infantry, it's gonna have to go. And by go, I mean let's remove a bunch of plastic. Starting with the shoulder boards, I removed the details that made this a French long coat, including the buttons and the French rifle pouches around the waist. Next, I started shaving away the fold-over sections of the coat, doing my best to blend what remained into the rest of the fabric. I also cut away the collar because oh wait, I forgot to tell you what I was going for, didn't I? I figured I could resculpt this miniature to represent a Moroccan Goumier. The Goumier were colonial troops under French jurisdiction, and they wore a very distinct coat known as a djellaba. And I'm sorry if I mispronounced that. Anyways, with all the necessary French details removed, I began filling in the front of the jacket with globs of green stuff. The process was to add an amount of putty, shape it, add some more, shape that, and so on. I find it's easier to add more putty than to remove it. As always, I did my best to blend the green stuff and plastic together for a seamless fit. I also wanted the right side to cure before moving on to the left, so I turned my focus to the hood found on the djellaba. There are more refined techniques out there for sculpting hoods, but I am perfectly content just slapping a ball of green stuff onto the back of the neck and shaping it. I flattened the lower section more than the upper, blended the corners into the plastic around the shoulders, and dug out a little cavity on top. The putty cures slowly, so there's plenty of time to shape, reshape, or even start completely over until you're satisfied with the result. Next, I filled in the left side of the jacket and layered it over the right just a bit. Again, I was going for the basic shape on this pass. Then, I mixed up a fresh batch of green stuff with more yellow than blue and started on a final, smoother layer for the front of the coat. Then, using the same technique as with Captain K's cloak, I began sculpting some folds in the coat from small green stuff sausages. I used a Winter German model as a guide for where to place these folds. Most were sculpted on the front, but I also had a few over the plastic areas where I scraped away the folded overcoat. Now I could finally take a break from green stuff and glue on a couple details like this French bread bag and these American BAR pouches. By the middle of the war, the Goumier were supplied with US weapons, including the BAR. And speaking of, that's what we are giving this model. The BAR from the US Infantry sprue is being held upwards, and I wanted to have it in a more horizontal grip. But first, I removed the weapon strap, as I didn't want it covering up all the detail I just sculpted, even though I just raved about weapon straps on my models on the last conversion. To get the pose I wanted, I shaved away the shoulder joint at an angle, so when I glued the arms to the body, the weapon would be held nice and level. To cover the gaps and finish off the djellaba, I added a blob of green stuff to the upper arm and shaped it into the short but wide sleeves found on the coat. Once the basic shape was created, I used my sculpting tool to add a couple folds in the fabric, and then repeated the process on the left arm. The final detail to add was a head. Many photos show the Goumier wearing their traditional headwear underneath an American, British, or French helmet. I grabbed a head from the Commonwealth sprue and removed the soft cap from the top. Then I found a British head and removed the helmet. By this point you could probably guess what happens next. It's the same exact process of drilling and scraping to haul out the helmet so it fits nicely on the head. And now, one Moroccan Goumier built the long way. All that was left to do was to paint these conversions up, and Well, we finally reached the end results. Most of these conversions were much more intense than the first round, but I learned quite a bit from the process. I am super happy with how the American paratrooper turned out, and I really am tempted to build some more, but I've been trying to decide on a desert force for some time now, and I think the Fulgore for North Africa is going to do it for me. I've got a video specifically covering them in the works, so stay on the lookout for that. As far as this video series goes, you'll notice that we still have not covered the Soviet sprues. Since they are some of the oldest plastics still in the lineup, I am betting they will be getting updated somewhat soon. We know that Bolt Action version 3 is being released with new Winter Fallschirmjäger and Winter Americans, so that gets us to 3 or 4 kits I haven't converted yet. Once that number hits 7 with new releases, we'll get Kitbash Every Sprue Part 3 going. Until then, let me know your favorite from this video down in the comments, and we'll see you next time. So this was a comment I got on my last Kitbash Every Sprue video, and I'm just going to get out ahead of it on this one. The warlord sculpts are pretty characterful, and they're almost bordering on cartoonish, but these faces look real bad with my painting on them. I take full responsibility for that. But I have mentioned many times that I'm not really doing painting tutorials. Maybe I should watch some and learn for myself, but you know, who do you think I am? Painting panzers?
A few months ago, I set out on the journey to create a Kitbasher conversion from every warlord bolt action sprue. The first part in this video series was a huge success, and now the time has finally come for the second batch of conversions to be documented. Welcome to Kitbash Every Sprue, Part 2.